And so a group of them took me to lunch and said, you really need an elegant and eloquent adversary for Alex. And so I had so much fun in this book creating Lem Howell, who is a fabulous lawyer and who dances circles around Alex in the courtroom, but in part doing exactly that and making life very unpleasant for the victim side of the case.
I would have thought that would always have been a haunting thing for you doing the sex crimes was, you know, the fact that so many women can be portrayed as having asked for it, but is that really, that came up in one of your other books too, didn't it?
Yes, and it's
was it the last one or the one before?
It was both. I mean, I've used some aspect of it. There is one case.
The one with the doctor. Is that Death Dance?
Likely to Die is the one with the doctor, and The Kills actually has a lot of a trial with a woman who went home with the defendant and therefore was accused of.
Right. But it isn't Likely to Die. I'm thinking, but maybe I'm confused, and I thought there was a plastic surgeon or something that came into it. But, you know, I read so many. Sorry, it may have blurred out on me there. But
throw all the names
nevertheless,
out. That's fine.
it is such a difficult area. I mean, I thought about law school just about the time that you graduated, and I can still remember. I detoured off and went to library school because I remember the faculty at the law school saying, you know, if you do this, you'll be allowed to do juvenile work or maybe domestic. And I thought to myself, I was a young mother, I thought to myself, I don't want to do that. You know? And so I headed off into library school, and it was maybe in the early 80s when I was able to read the law in Virginia. And even then, there was some question about whether, you know, women got to try cases. And then there I picked myself up one day in federal court looking at bank robberies and thought, yes.
Oh, it's great. And that's, I mean, it was so much, people think of the dark side, and obviously I'm a very upbeat person. I would never have stayed where it dark. I was a part of being able to, I mean, just at the right time, to be able to see women, help women triumph in the courtroom. So my time was, as I like to say, spent on the side of the angels, and I didn't spend a lot of time with the bad guys. And I think one of the things I try and show through Alex and her spirit and Mike and Mercer and the camaraderie is what progress we've made and how much more is possible, and that it's so much more likely that you can triumph now in the courtroom and give the witnesses dignity than was possible when I reached that door.
I think the witness's dignity part is particularly better now that there is evidence like DNA, and it doesn't turn into a slanging match, or, you know, how many guys did she sleep with, you know, and why is this one rape when the others were consensual, and on and on.
Exactly, and that's what happened to the woman I was talking about with the cold case. Her entire history was portrayed as though the guy who climbed through the fire escape and held a knife to her neck was the same as a beau from college. And she was on the stand for days. The first trial, I think it was 2.5 days. This time, a year and a half ago with DNA, she was on the witness stand less than 20 minutes. There were no questions on cross-examination. And it's just remarkable. And science.
I think it is too. You know, without getting, I've often thought that DNA evidence, as it gets more perfected, has a lot to say about death penalty arguments.
Yes.
Because if an objection has always been, what if it's an innocent person, the more certain you get that it is not an innocent person due to this kind of evidence, which is irrefutable most of the time. Although there certainly have been some ingenious crime writers who have figured out ways to fake DNA evidence.
Absolutely,
even.
absolutely.
In fact, didn't Scott Turow in Presumed Innocent, wasn't that kind of an early form of that?
Very early form. It was using the science, but doing a very creative thing with getting the evidence, obviously, onto the victim.
You bet,
side.
dated now, but nevertheless points
Pretty
to
good.
him for having even thought of it, you know.
And in Bad Blood, I use a very new DNA point that, and I stay very current and continue to do a lot of consulting and victim advocacy, but a fascinating point that I learned from physicians doing medical science that, I was rushing to get into a book before it was on SVU or something like that. And it's a fascinating plot device, and they will, as you say, the science continues to evolve, which is an interesting part of it. It's not just the technique was discovered by Crick and Watson and then used forensically in the 80s, but it continues to be perfected and changed. The technique is entirely different. So you will see crime writers, for for a long time in the foreseeable future, being able to tweak what happens with the science.
Absolutely true. And then, of course, we're getting other kinds of forensic evidence. I just read Dr. Bill Bass's new book with John Jefferson, although I think actually Bill's the consultant, John writes the books, but whatever. And he runs the body farm at UT, and he has some very good, good science in his.
Yes.
There's science and science, but, he is an expert. And I was fascinated at the library, if you will call it that, of bodies and decomposition techniques and all that they are building up at UT to help determine, and that goes to alibi evidence too, because the more precisely you can determine how long a body has been dead, whether it's entomology or, decomposition and all the rest of it, the better chance you have of pinpointing the time and thus where somebody was.
Absolutely. I read his first one, and it is fascinating. Of course, read The Body Farm long ago, and until I read The Body Farm, it had never even occurred to me, because we're so urban in New York, and we think we're good at everything, and our medical examiners do everything. Well, we don't have kind of farmland to do this with that kind of research, and it is truly a fascinating
It's in a big bend in the river. I did my library degree at the University of Tennessee, and little did I know that, not too far away was this. In fact, he'd started it then, so I had no idea. It was very quiet. Nobody went around talking about all this bodies in the ground, and sort of rotting away down there, and bugs and all the rest of it. But it is an ideal campus for that, and now it's becoming, a fairly well-known
and a center
facility.
for study. Yes.
And then, Kathy Reichs, your fellow crime writer at Scribner, has done very well with her TV program, Bones, and, been a lot of stuff
she just emailed
there.
me an hour ago and said to give you a big hug.
Oh, good. Well, I was really
She'll be
happy
back
to see
soon.
that Bones got renewed. And in fact, I've been meaning to write to her because, hilariously enough, as we just trekked through Spain, my little granddaughter was accompanied by a whole season full of Bones on DVD so she could watch it at her mom's computer whenever she got bored, and that was her program of choice. She's 11. And I'm going,
I know, isn't it remarkable?
Really?
People come into the stores and I say, can my son or daughter read these? I was with my grandsons yesterday over the weekend and brought Bad Blood for their mother, and the 12-year-old picked it up. I said, not yet, but these kids are exposed to it everywhere, and most of them seem to deal with it really well.
They do. And I was thinking how sophisticated, at 11, I didn't know anything about stuff like that.
No.
She's probably really sophisticated in forensic techniques, and God only knows what she'll grow up to be. Well, another element of your books we've talked about, because I always think of your books as having sort of triple legs to stand on, one of which, of course, is your prosecutorial experience and what you bring there. Another is the Martha's Vineyard. But the third, in which I think you have the most fun, although I'm just guessing here, is the whole bit about the history of Manhattan. How in the world did that become part of the books?
I love it. It was not part of Final Jeopardy in the first book, but the second book, Likely to Die, is set in a hospital in New York that looks a lot like Bellevue, but for reasons of libel and whatever else, we gave it another name. But we had a tragic occurrence, a murder in the early 80s in Bellevue of a young woman doctor who was killed in her office at night by a homeless man, which is not my plot, a homeless man who lived on the roof of the hospital in warm weather and in closets in cold weather. And he dressed by just going into supply closets and taking out, an orderly's jacket and putting it on. Nobody questioned him. And of course, we all know those food trays that sit outside on the trolleys in the large hallways, and whoever finishes a tray of hospital food. So he ate and dressed and used the showers on the hallway occasionally, and killed this woman, surprised her in her office at night. And so I began to do the history of the hospital, the medical facilities in New York.